Okay, cool.
Okay. Are we all ready to start?
Yeah,
Okay,
get going.
so I'm the first speaker. Hi, today me and my team will be arguing why the US should prioritize adaptation to climate change rather than fight climate change. So, a nation that is strong in the face of rising seas, extreme weather, and shifting climate, where communities thrive despite the challenge of a changing world. In this urgent debate on climate action, it's time for the US to shift its focus toward adaptation and prioritize strategies that directly address the problem. While the fight against climate change is crucial, adaptation offers immediate solutions for those already feeling this effect. And so, hi, I'm Annika Smith. My group will be discussing the ongoing climate change. It is important that we reevaluate our strategies and continue our important shift. Today, I present the affirmative case for why the US should prioritize adaptation over fighting it. So, moving to my first point, it's about social fairness. Adaptation measures can promote social fairness by prioritizing the needs of vulnerable and marginalized communities that have been affected by climate change by ensuring access to important services, fairness distribution of resources, and inclusive decision-making process. Adaptation efforts can reduce disparities and enhance community cohesion and well-being. And then moving on to my next point, it's economic benefits. Adaptation initiatives can stimulate economic growth and create jobs. Investment in infrastructure such as flood barriers, green spaces, and drought resistant crops not only enhances the community, but also creates employment opportunities in construction, engineering, and agricultural divisions, which contribute to economic development. And the World Bank estimates that climate change could push over 100 million people into poverty by 2030 if no action is taken to adapt. The Global Commission of Adaptation reports that investing $1.8 trillion globally in five key areas of adaptation between 2020 and 2030 can generate $7.1 trillion in total net benefits, which leads me to my next point about cost effect solutions. In short terms, adaptation can be more cost effective, can have more cost effective strategies. Immediate measures to protect against extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and changing particip- or weather patterns can save lives and resources. These measures provide a tangible and immediate benefits while working towards a long-term solution. And so early warning systems, climate infrastructures, improved dryland agriculture, global protection, and investments in making water resources more effective are just like some ways that we can help. And then in conclusion, prioritizing adaptation is not a fight against climate change, but rather a strategy and an effective approach. It allows us to fix and present while laying the groundwork for a sustainable future. And embracing adaptation is proactive and empowering to the challenges we face today. And it's an urgent and important way for us to live a better life. Thank you.
Um, okay, give me 2 seconds, please. Sorry. So, one of the things I want to touch on is your reference to the economy, like particularly for California. I think it's applicable with agriculture being such a massive part of California's economy. Um, how does this prioritizing this adaptation uh, deal with these long-term effects the agricultural community is facing in terms of climate change with increased wildfires destroying crops, increased just increased general temperatures destroying crops, severe weather and such destroying crops in farmable land.
Can you like just repeat the last part of the question? Sorry.
Just the general question was, how does this prioritizing adaptation over mitigation help and prevent the increase of severe weather incidents or events, maybe is the word, that affect the ability of the agricultural community to produce?
I think I read something where like it's shown that there's like important like benefits to adaptation, and it said that one estimate found that there was $1 million invested in renewable infrastructures and energy sources. So I think if we just focus on that, then like these other like events like wildfires like won't happen. I just think we need to focus on like trying to stop one thing at a time, if that makes sense.
Definitely. That's a great point. But that transition though to clean energy and such is considered a form of mitigation rather than adaptation. But that's an important point. And then continuing to touch on that, you brought up also the cost of this transition, or not the transition of adaptation versus mitigation. How do you like blanking on the word? How do you support? Support's not for the word. There's a massive difference. So you like the adaptation has a lower short term expense, but how do you outweigh that versus the long term? Because adaptation doesn't necessarily solve the issue of the continually growing global temperature, rather just makes it more comfortable for us to live in that increased global temperature. And then you will continue to have to pay more for to make it more comfortable. How do you outweigh that short-term cost of making us comfortable versus resolving the issue?
That's a great question. I think that like we just need to have like a solution right now before it starts getting worse. I think that like yes, like in the long term it could hurt us, but I think we just need to find a solution now before it starts to get like what I just said starts to get worse. I just think we need to live comfortably right now, and then we can find more resources and more solutions to figure it out in the long run. And like as we like adapt to it, I think we can find more like suitable and sustainable like features for us to live comfortably in the long run, if that made sense too.
Yeah, no, I do. I understand. Remember correctly, it was according to the
Wait, you cut out for a second. What were you saying?
no, sorry, I paused because I was
Oh,
trying to
sorry.
read the name. Okay, apparently the website doesn't exist anymore. That's fun. Uh, um, but so it was an IPCC. Um, it was an IPCC report, which is an intergovernmental panel on climate change, which is part of the United Nations. Um, the as you said, the adaptation is a band-aid over the overall issue, and but the if we wait longer to start to mitigate, according to this IPCC, like the cost continues to grow. So make an initial investment now in that mitigation efforts. So when we do need to adapt a little bit, the cost won't be as much.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think there's just like both like two sides of the situation. Like we either act now or act later, but I think if we act now, we'll have more resources in the long run because then we can figure out what we actually need to like figure out climate change.
Okay. I think that took our spot. So, Aisha, you're ready.
Yeah, give me just 1 second.
Oh,
Okay. So, climate change, as we've established, is one of the most challenging problems that humanity has ever faced. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, a nonprofit developed by climate experts, hundreds of millions of lives, countless species and ecosystems, the health of our economy, and the future habitability of Earth are all at stake. As such, our position stands by the concept that merely adapting to climate change is not an effective long-term strategy. While we have established through this debate and prior ones that adaptation is certainly also necessary, it is important to note that actively fighting against climate change needs to be the priority. If we keep trying to solely adapt, we'll only be delaying the problem at hand. The opposition may argue that mitigation is only beneficial in the long term, and that short-term problems affecting our citizens can only be addressed by adaptation. However, this is not true. Long-term fighting to reduce carbon emissions isn't the only method of combating climate change. Short-lived climate pollutants, also known as SLCPs, including black carbon, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, and tropospheric ozone, are also powerful climate forcers with global warming potentials many times that of carbon dioxide. And so there are measures and technologies to reduce SLCPs that are available today and are practical, technically feasible, and cost-effective. So by implementing these measures, we can immediately bring climate benefits and improve the health and livelihoods of millions. Due to the relatively short lifetime of SLCPs in the atmosphere, ranging from a few days to a few decades, reducing their emissions can rapidly slow the rate of global temperature rise and complement efforts to mitigate carbon dioxide emissions and keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. And so all these studies conducted by the Climate and Clean Air Coalition's measures state that through these methods, methane emissions can be reduced by at least 40% and black carbon by up to 70% by 2030. And so to fight climate change, we must recognize that although it cannot truly be stopped, it can be slowed to the point of a near halt. So as I mentioned the carbon emissions before, this can ultimately be achieved by reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050 or sooner, as explained by the Union of Concerned Scientists. So net zero means that on balance, no more carbon is dumped into the atmosphere than is taken out. And the easiest way to do this is by planting new forests, a process known as afforestation, or restoring old ones known as reforestation. So there are also new technologies that have been developed that suck carbon dioxide out of the air, known as direct air capture, or preventing it from leaving smokestacks altogether, called carbon capture or storage. And this all seems simple enough, but the issue here is that Americans cannot reach a consensus as to what to do with climate change. Some, like the opposition in this debate, still maintain the belief that adaptation is all that is necessary, preventing effective long-term action like the methods I just brought up from being put into place. So this discourse causes others to hold the belief that climate change isn't even real or won't affect them in their lifetimes, which is extremely dangerous. A study in the Current Opinion in Behavioral Science called We Need Climate Change Mitigation and Climate Change Mitigation Needs the We depicts just how important united social belief in fighting against climate change is to actually preventing the spread of the event itself. This taps into a human psychological phenomenon known as collective efficacy, or the extent to which people perceive their group to be effective in reaching its goals. The study found that strong beliefs about the human capability to mitigate climate change increased private sphere collective climate action, as well as activist behavior and the acceptance of climate policies. Therefore, we can see how vital it is that society understands that fighting against climate change or mitigating it is really important and how detrimental it will be if society continues to either ignore climate change altogether or continue to try to aimlessly adapt. Furthermore, climate change has been amongst the top priorities of the Biden administration, whose actions on the issue include rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement and the passage of an infrastructure bill with funding for renewable energy. And so ratings of Biden's approach to climate change and the federal government's role dealing with the issue are obviously quite deeply split between the two parties, as expected. A majority of Republicans say that Biden's climate policies are taking the country in the wrong direction, while Democrats believe that he's moving the country in the right direction on climate policy. But despite these polarized attitudes, the Pew Research Center survey of 10,000 US adults conducted in May of 2022 finds one subject in which Americans have achieved broad public agreement on. And so a large majority of Americans, 90% of them, say that they favor planting about 1 trillion trees to absorb carbon emissions to help reduce the effects of climate change. And 79% favor providing a tax credit to encourage businesses to develop technology to capture and store carbon emissions, which are both methods of fighting climate change. And so both of these policies of fighting climate change are actually backed by sizable majorities of Republicans and Democrats alike. And so, in other words, though they might not know the exact term for it, most Americans, though divided in so many aspects, are in almost unanimous agreement that climate change should be fought against. If two parties with such a large history of division have managed to identify that fighting climate change is the true solution, then we should be able to reach that agreement as well. Thank you.
Okay, I have a few questions for you. So my first one is, why is the long run so important than like the short run?
Because ultimately, the long term is what we're fighting for. If we're only going to keep addressing issues in the short term, things are going to keep changing and things are going to keep getting worse. I feel like it's sort of fruitless to continue to only act in the short term, when in the long term, the goal is to reduce climate change, like to reduce carbon emissions and to ultimately like combat climate change. If we're only going to look into the short term, there's no point. Like there's a future ahead of us, there's generations ahead of us that climate change will continue to impact.
Okay, and then my second question is, by transitioning from like fossil fuels, there will be an economic downturn and many jobs will be lost. What do you think we should do to account for these people?
As for jobs being lost in the long term, sorry, could you repeat that? What was the reason that there was going to be an economic downturn?
Like by transitioning from fossil fuels, there would be an economic downturn and many jobs will be lost. So what should we do to account for these people that lost their job?
Well, the thing is, what I was also mentioning about the SLCPs, the short-lived climate pollutants, it's actually been proven by the Coalition of Climate Change that the impacts of short-lived climate pollutants on public health and ecosystems have economic consequences right now. So keeping those pollutants in the air have economic consequences. And so reducing short-lived climate pollutants can have immediate economic benefits because of job creation and increased household income, like improved climate, like improved public health, reduce poverty and inequality. Because when we're reducing these short-lived climate pollutants and implementing technology to fight that, it's actually creating a lot of jobs for people to be attaining. And so because of that, perhaps like the research that you conducted on switching from fossil fuels is showing that there's going to be an economic downturn, but also by transitioning into technologies that are benefiting the fight of climate change, jobs will be created. So I don't exactly know if a downturn would be imminent.
Um, yeah. Okay, those are all the questions I have.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think it's my turn. Can you guys hear like a vacuum in the background?
I think you're fine.
Okay, cool. Then I'll start. So I'm debating for why the USA should prioritize adaptation to climate change rather than fighting climate change. So as the specter of climate change looms ever larger on the global stage, the United States finds itself at a critical juncture where decisions and mitigation and adaptation strategies will profoundly shape the nation's future. While mitigating climate change remains an imperative goal, it is becoming increasingly evident that prioritizing adaptation efforts is much more crucial. I'm contending that the United States should shift its emphasis towards prioritizing adaptation over climate change mitigation, recognizing that the impacts of climate change are already underway and necessitate immediate action to safeguard communities, infrastructure, and the well-being of its citizens. By focusing on adaptation, the U.S. can fortify its resilience against the escalating threats posed by changing climate, thereby securing a more sustainable and secure future for generations to come. Humans have caused major climate changes to happen already, and we have set in motion more changes still. However, if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases today, the rising global temperatures would begin to flatten within a few years. Temperatures would then plateau but remain elevated for many, many centuries. This quote from NASA in their article, "Is it too late to prevent climate change?" shows that we need to put a complete total halt to greenhouse gases in order for us to alleviate climate change. In order for the global temperature to just flatten, it won't reduce any of the natural disasters going on. It merely plateaus the temperature, and it won't be for many centuries before temperatures start to decrease. To even get to the point of stopping the emission of greenhouse gases might take us a century. According to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, in 2021, the U.S. produced 6,340 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. This is around 14 trillion pounds of CO2. To expect the U.S. to completely diminish the production of greenhouse gases is a plan that will take many years in itself, and even after we achieve this, we need to wait many centuries before this change even starts to have an impact and decrease global temperatures. This is why we need a solution now. Climate change disproportionately affects vulnerable communities and nations that have contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions. Developing countries will suffer the most from the impacts of climate change. According to the National Library of Medicine, the poorest and least powerful people already live in a situation with poor water supply and sanitation, which is compounded by natural disasters. We need to start by helping these developing countries adapt. Developing countries have already tried to adapt. In a research project by Adaptive in South Africa, they state, people are adapting by planting fast-maturing crops, eating wild fruits, collecting wild seeds, selling their animals, seeking paid work in town, and trying to start up cash-generating businesses. But it is clear that there is a limit on how much these developing countries have. Some ways developing countries can develop include early warning systems. A warning system that warns them early can produce subsequent damage by 30%. Ecosystem restoration is very good for adapting as a single tree provides the cooling effect as 2 air conditioners running for 2 hours, for 24 hours. Mangrove trees are very efficient in providing natural sea defenses from storm surges by reducing the height and strength of sea waves. Mangroves are 1,000 times less expensive than building seawalls. Climate-resistant infrastructures, which are assets and systems such as roads, bridges, and power lines that can withstand shocks from extreme climate impacts. Infrastructure is very important as it is responsible for 88% for forecasted costs for adapting to climate change. Water supply and security. By 2030, it is estimated that 1 in 2 people will face water shortages. Water is a very crucial part in everyone's lifestyle. Developing countries not only need water for drinking, but it is also a huge part on their agriculture. Systems we could incorporate include solar-powered wells, boreholes, micro-irrigation technologies, or water reuse systems. In conclusion, as the United States grapples with the escalating challenges posed by climate change, the imperative to strike a balance between mitigation and adaptation strategies becomes increasingly apparent. While mitigating greenhouse gas emissions remain crucial for the long-term health of the planet, the urgency of adapting to the existing and anticipated impacts cannot be overstated. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, perfect. I just have a couple questions.
Okay.
You mentioned strategies like implementing certain technologies or like planting trees, things that developing countries are doing in order to adapt to climate change. But my question is, do you think that that is the most cost-effective method, especially because you're saying that climate change is particularly impacting these underrepresented like minority groups? Because as climate change gets worse, these adaptations aren't actually putting an end to climate change. So we're going to have to continue to create more and more advanced adaptations if we're going to focus on that. So I was wondering if you think that that's actually an efficient method for those communities.
Um, yes, I think so. Our prompt is the USA should prioritize adaptation. So I think it's more of like create an adaptation for these developing countries now so that they are able to like survive like these natural disasters. And after we get them situated, then we can like um look into fighting the climate change. But as of right now, if we don't help them adapt, um they'll struggle more than we than us. I don't
Okay.
know if that
And
makes
also,
sense.
no, I got it. I was also wondering because you did mention that the prompt was whether or not the United States itself should prioritize adaptation or mitigation, but you did mention a lot of other developing countries. The United States is a fairly established country, like we have a fairly established like wealth. I was wondering like because you mentioned so many of these developing countries, what do you think the United States itself should actually do?
Okay. Um, 1 second.
Sorry, I had to step away for a moment. Are y'all still doing your cross
Yes.
examination?
Sorry.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
Um, not too sure about that. I feel like the best way the United States could adapt is by lowering the emissions, but even then, it like takes like a long time.
Hmm. Okay, yeah. I was just wondering because I thought that ultimately, a form of mitigation is lowering those emissions. So I feel like that is mitigation and not necessarily adaptation. But I got your point. Thank you.
Hmm.
I have no further questions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So most of the well-known organizations and reputable organizations that you may look at in regards to this climate change versus mitigation say that yes, adaptation is part of it, but they always preface it with mitigation is the primary goal because we need to reduce global emissions overall in order to stop needing to adapt. And one of the big things we can do as a mitigation effort is to make a more sustainable and better transportation system for us. Like a perfect example, if you look at like Japan or European countries and such in their public transportation systems, most people don't use cars in those places. They solely rely on their public transportation systems. New York City is another perfect example. It's walkable and it has a robust public transportation system that people can use. And you can really see this. Um, so this website's not. So this is information is from the United Nations, the IEA, and the Emissions Database for Global Atmospheric Research on your carbon output per capita throughout the world. So if you look at like the U.S., for example, we make 15.32 tons of carbon emission per capita. here in the United States. Whereas you look at most European countries, so at the most, you have like the Netherlands with 9.54 tons, Germany 9.42, and etc. And so you look at that difference, like in Europe, for example, with our transportation systems and having a robust transportation system, Europe, their public transport moves 10.75 million passengers annually compared to North America, where our public transportation systems only move sorry, I had that backwards. Europe moves 10.75 billion people annually through their public transportation systems compared to the United States that only moves 3.73 billion people on our public transportation systems. And it's well known that our heavy reliance on cars, and especially, fossil fuel burning cars, is a large contributor to carbon output here in the United States. And with mitigation, one of our key points is reducing that overall output of climate emissions. So yeah, there are stop gaps for that with transitioning to hybrid electric cars, hydrogen cars, etc. But again, there's still stop gaps, and we have still a decent amount of carbon output from having to produce those electric cars with their batteries and stuff. And then there's just other general human rights issues with producing electric cars, particularly with the lithium, versus a bus. It's a little bit more to produce one unit, but a bus can move 50 to 100 people fairly easily. And it takes up less distance. So we have to build less roads, which is also or in at least smaller roads, which also reduces our carbon output from having to produce asphalt and stuff. And so it's a cascading effect, building that more sustainable transportation system and eliminating many factors of our current car-centric transportation system that produce large amounts of that carbon output. And again, you can really see that with our total carbon output per capita here in the United States versus European countries. And then just overall in Europe, because it's a semi-comparable population. Like total European population is about double what the United States is, but we have a semi-comparable carbon output between the two areas. And then so really moving to that, not only does it better our climate position with having more sustainable transportation and outputting less carbon, it also is just equitable, and it provides more access to different goods and services to people who live throughout the United States, having a more robust and available public transportation system. I think that was it for me. I bet.
Okay. I think I only have one question. So you mentioned making better public transportation.
Mm-hmm.
To get to the point of Japan's public system, it's going to take a lot of money, a lot of workforce just to have it built. But how can we be sure that even after it's built, the people will use it? Because even now, people rarely use buses, and yes, not very convenient. It's still a system available, and it's not really used.
So the issue is, part of it is we are a car-centric society, but also most public transportations aren't very robust. Buses are good. There's different levels of public transportation, though. You have buses, I forget the term for it, but buses are for your short distances. It's only successful when you combine many different types of public transportation together to form a successful overall public transportation system. If you look at London, for example, is a perfect example. They have a robust train and metro system that goes out throughout their city that you can easily use. And then for your shorter distances between those stations, you utilize their bus system to get there. So it's a combination of them. And then it's also just the way our country is designed. The key term in terms of that is urban sprawl. So you have many things very far spread apart, which makes it more difficult for that public transportation system. Where if you look at our like larger cities, they're built more vertical rather than spread out, which makes that simpler. California has San Luis Obispo is a perfect example for how it works semi well. We have many Amtrak stops throughout the county, as well as very robust bus system here in San Luis Obispo, and it's a perfect example. But it's still is an issue because the investment into it is not where it should be, where it makes it disadvantageous to utilize a bus system versus use the bus system versus a car, because everything is still so far spread out. It makes it reasonable to successfully use the public transportation system to conduct what you need. And so it just changes it requires a mentality switch and public sentiment change, which is not impossible. Basically, it works. You can look at New York City. They have one of the busiest public transportation systems in the world, and it operates fairly successfully.
Okay, I think that was it. I'm still a bit confused because are you saying that we should like just change everything so that everything's more close together, or are we changing the transportation systems?
Well, like I said, it's a combination of things. Just with any form of our climate thing, whether you're doing your adaptation or mitigation or both at the same time, it requires to be cognizant of that to make it successful. There's a chart from the government of New South Wales in Australia that's like, forget the term for the type of chart, but it lists out or shows certain things that fall into rather adaptation or mitigation. And one of the key points they bring up that's a balance between our mitigation and adaptation strategies is their smart building design, as well as climate integrated land use planning. And so just better use of the land available to us is a key point that balances our mitigation and adaptation, so they tie together. And a key point of mitigation is a sustainable transportation network that reduces the use of personal vehicles, which in turn reduces overall CO2 and carbon output. It's a trickle down. It combines everything in order to be successful.
Okay, I'm done with questions. Now I think we're on rebuttal.
Yeah, we can do our preparation time. So I mean, I guess we'll call our group and then we can talk and do our preparation. So give us a second. Hey, sorry, I had it backwards. It's actually affirmative side.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry.
Okay. So I'll just start mine because I'm just reading off what our rebuttal person had. Okay. Climate change is something that we are able to keep track of in the past, but we cannot predict it because it is an always changing phenomenon. The human ability to mitigate or nearly reverse climate change is an ambition that would take far too many people in an effort that would take several years, which would have to be done perfectly. This is far too unrealistic. In addition, climate change has in the past and will evolve into something else that we don't exactly know yet. What we do know is that heat waves are lasting longer and are getting hotter. Sea levels are starting to rise and droughts are becoming more frequent. This, surprisingly, can be seen as benefits for some places, but understandably a negative in the grand scheme of the Earth's health. What I mean by this, I will explain in my second point. The Paris Agreement of 2015, a global consensus that by a certain amount of years, most countries, if not the entire world, will be at zero carbon emissions. In response, it said that, according to the Climate Portal, an article written by the Massachusetts Institution of Technology and the Environmental Solutions Initiative claim. Today, however, mitigation is not on track to meet either of these goals. In fact, greenhouse gas emissions are still rising worldwide. In addition, the climate portal by the same writers included how certain features of climate change are quote unquote locked in, such as sea levels rising, and that no matter if temperatures stabilize in the future or not, there's nothing that can be done in reverse to these damages. Essentially, these damages become permanent. These points indicate how climate change mitigation is a goal for humans that is unreachable. We have done so much damage to the health of our planet that even in a homeostasis-like base, we cannot do anything no matter how much we work together. Where does that leave us? To adapt. The argument against adaptation is also made that no matter the structures or ideas of what we can build to help make an adaptation possible, it is simply impossible due to the unpredictable nature of climate change. In rebuttal to this, again stated by the climate portal in that quote, in Bangladesh, one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, the port city of Mongla is investing in embankments, drainage, flood control gates, and water treatment to get ahead of rising waters, and economic development to provide refugee and work opportunities for thousands of people displaced from nearby towns. A list of many different options on what can be done to manage the sea levels rising as opposed to past adaptation failures like the 2011 Japan floods or the Arizona irrigation project. Adaptation is overlooked as being a versatile practice and seen more narrowly on what has been tried and what has not worked. A point to mitigation defenders that shows it can never work. However, different places will require different uses of adaptation, and certain countries or cities will have to face the consequences before they can see the benefits. Stated by the Center for Science Education, changes in the amount of precipitations are making farming a challenge. Farmers are adapting their techniques, planting drought-resistant crops, and making irrigation more efficient. This shows just how different and unique it is to apply adaptation into our rapidly warming planet. I'm done with our rebuttal.
Okay, I'll get started with mine then. Adaptation is a short-term, smaller, or I'm sorry, let me start off with the argument for the economic value of adaptation versus mitigation. Adaptation is a short-term, smaller expense, but we have to pay for it over and over again in the long term, because it's not directly solving the issue. It's just adapting to the effects of climate change, which keep getting worse and worse over the years. Investing in the fight against climate change will reduce the cost of maintaining it in the future. So if we try to tackle the problem at its root now, we can improve over the years and have to do that less and less as it becomes less of a problem. As climate change gets worse, it gets harder and harder to continue to financially support adaptation, because the effects of climate change, again, just keep getting worse, especially for low-income communities and people with less access to funding. For example, improving infrastructure to support water, like sea level rises, is extremely expensive, and probably too expensive for a lot of communities. And as climate change progresses, it becomes harder and harder to have the ability to adapt. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, if we start putting effort into sucking carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases out of our air through different avenues, we can actually effectively reverse the effects that they've had on us. And according to Worldmeters, the United States is the second biggest producer of carbon emissions in the world, which cannot be masked by adaptation. As long as we continue to produce greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions, we will continue to harm our environment and harm our atmosphere, and that cannot be adapted to for long, if at all. One of the best ways to reverse this is afforestation, which is fixing deforestation by planting trees and repairing the forests that have been destroyed over time. It is vital that we encourage the public to understand that fighting climate change is possible, because once the public understands that we are not too far gone from mitigation, people will be more inclined to make a change in their everyday lives. And making a change in people's everyday lives is little by little how we can begin and end the fight. So that might also include new public transit systems that are more similar to European ones. The United States is extremely driven by people having their personal vehicles, but if we were to change that and make more accessible public transit, we can definitely fight the emissions that personal cars cause. And to conclude, I just want to say that when somebody has a bleeding gash, they go and get stitches to fix the problem at its core. Prioritizing adaptation is like putting a Band-Aid over a bleeding gash. It might stop some of the bleeding at the time, but it will not heal the problem, and it will not heal the problem to its core. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we're done then.
Yeah, I think that wraps it up. We don't have to go back to the main room, do we?
No,
I don't
we
think
can
so.
leave after this.
All right, perfect then. Thank you guys. That was good.
Thank you.
guys.